All right. Thank you, everyone, for signing in. This is the Cross Cultural Center's first podcast called Cultivating Conversation. Today's topic will be talking about anti-Asian sentiment and anti-Blackness during COVID-19. My name is James King. I am one of 4 social justice educator interns at the Cross. I am a 5th year Revelle College applied mathematics and African American studies minor. And yeah.
Hey y'all, my name is Jelena. I go by she, her pronouns. I am also a social justice educator here at the Cross. I am a 4th year majoring in clinical psychology with a minor in global health.
Hi everyone, my name is Isabella. I'm also one of the social justice educator interns. I'm currently a 4th year at ERC. My gender pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm double majoring in ethnic studies and history and minoring in educational studies.
Dope. Also, my pronouns are he, him, his. Forgot to say it in the beginning.
So I know for me, when we're thinking of a podcast subject, I know I've been having a lot of trouble navigating anti-Asian sentiments amidst COVID-19 because I think about how for me, it doesn't seem like the same efforts for racism has been pushed for other folks, especially when we think about anti-Blackness. And it's also especially frustrating because I feel like a lot of fights against anti-Asian racism is framed purely for the racism that Asian Americans are going through, but there's not really a call for action for the racism that has always been existing before COVID-19.
I originally agree with the idea because I thought it was really complex in the sense that, like, we're looking at these anti-Asian sentiments during COVID-19, but also juxtaposing it to anti-Blackness and how, like, those two things, they coincide very well during this pandemic, but also two very different things that can also affect people differently, and how it's different, just how many ways we can discuss and talk about it. I thought it was really interesting.
I also found this topic interesting because, especially during this time, there's been a lot of anti-Asian sentiment, but then it's continuously overshadowing what's happening with the Black community, and a lot of the times that anti-Asian racism is fueling anti-Blackness, which isn't really mentioned in terms of what's been like being portrayed on media, especially with what Jelena mentioned. We mentioned this before when coming up with ideas, is that Black folks are being disproportionately killed by COVID-19. And yeah, if Jelena, you want to go on more about that.
Yeah. So it was interesting because when I tried looking up deaths by ethnicity a couple days ago, granted that today is April 18th, the CDC website said that ethnicity was not relevant because the areas in which most of the outbreaks were happening didn't reflect the population of the United States as a whole. But today, when I was looking it up earlier, all of a sudden the CDC had these ethnicity percentages. And of course, it's not surprising to see that like Black folks are having increasingly more cases as well as deaths. So the fact that they said the population does not reflect the United States as a whole, it begs the question of why is the population that doesn't reflect the United States as a whole dying more and catching the cases more? And then when we're comparing like what's happening to Asian Americans and what's happening to Black folks, the CDC stated that of all the cases, 4.4% were Asians. So that was around 5,000 versus a 30% were Black folks, which is around 36,000. So that's nearly 7 times more. So that's also why it's hard for me to navigate, because while there are these sentiments like who's actually like losing their lives over these things.
Yeah, yeah, I definitely agree because I don't even like a statement like, yeah, it doesn't reflect the United States population. I don't know, that in itself is kind of a problem, like when it's so unproportionate. So I looked up a few different statistics, and one that really stood out to me. In Wisconsin, Black people represent 6% of the population and nearly 40% of COVID-19 facilities, which is really, I think that's the most terrifying statistic I've seen so far. And that in itself is really, really scary. Um, and even the fact that, like, or how it is disproportionately affecting Black people, if you really look at like the reasons, they make
Mm-hmm.
sense, because if in reality, like anyone who is living in an urban area or in general isn't rich or wealthy, you're going to be more susceptible to it because of these different economical, socioeconomical hardships and challenges. So the the different things that are like said as to it not being a race issue, I mean, it's not like black people are just going to be more susceptible to it just off of that alone. But when you think about all these different factors, okay, yeah, then it makes sense. But we always kind of want to leave it at race and never try to tie
Mm-hmm.
things in.
Yeah.
But then, of course,
And
like, sorry,
oh no, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, and that's just kind of one side of the whole discussion we're even having, though, because then also on top of that, if you look at like anti-Asian sentiments and a lot of different things that have been happening in different Asian communities in regards to xenophobia, being alienated essentially from a lot of different parts of society, or even people not even wanting to go to Asian-owned businesses, things of that nature. It's really interesting and intriguing looking at how everything's playing out. That was it. Sorry.
It's okay. Um, and also thinking about legacies of slavery and the Jim Crow era, and also redlining, and how that has contributed to how folks are being placed, specifically black and brown folks are being placed in overcrowded communities, which prevents social distancing from occurring. And also thinking about who's the essential workers, which are typically black and brown folks, and also who has access to healthcare, and how certain folks are not being afforded that type of healthcare and are provided the luxury in terms of time to go to their healthcare facilities to have access to certain tests or even having like a mask or a PPE.
Yeah. So I like what both of y'all are saying. I definitely thought about environmental racism, and that's a thing that's been happening for so long. It's interesting because the other day I was talking to someone, and they were kind of like happy how La Jolla doesn't hasn't or our curve is kind of flat here. Um, but in my head, I thought, yeah, because we think about the affluent population that lives here, and we think about the students that are able to stay here. Yeah, like just talking about what Isabella brought up.
I have one question to pose, and it's usually brought into topics when talking about or when juxtaposing like races with one another is like the question of oppression Olympics. And I think that's going to be mentioned when we talk about this is how do we think about oppression Olympics when thinking about or talking about anti-Asian sentiment and anti-Blackness sentiment, and how to combat the rhetoric of oppression Olympics.
I don't know. The whole notion of the Depression Olympics is always so annoying and irritating because it's almost like there's this idea that there's actually a genuine prize. In reality, like, no. Even if we were all competing to see who's the most oppressed, at the end of it, what do you get? You get a lot of oppression and a lot of pain and a lot of tears and a lot of death. So that in itself is just not even correct. And on top of that, oppressions really can't even be measured or compared because okay, just if we even think about like thresholds for pain, if I pinch myself and say you two were to pinch yourselves, we might not even consider that to be the same level of pain. Maybe for you two it's like a 1 or 2. For me, it's like a 7 or something. That in itself, like there's no, it's not even equal in that rate. So I don't know. That's the phrase is always so annoying,
Mm-hmm.
personally.
When I think about that, I think about how for me, like a lot of my frustration with what we're talking about is seeing where the blame is put. So I think, like, while I really don't believe in oppression Olympics, I think other folks are under, like, they're under a lens where they think that is, like, because it's happening to them, it's feels more real, and they're ignoring what's happening to other communities. So it's frustrating seeing that they're blaming like directly the people that are being racist to them as if racism didn't exist before and come from more structural frameworks. Um, but yeah.
Mm, I also don't agree with the Prussian Olympics, but I felt like it was bound to come into conversation because, like, um, when I see folks talking about race, they often bring up the notion of like, oh, who's like more oppressed or who's more marginalized, and I think that's not the objective of these type of conversations. And I think the objective is to like bring it into conversation because I mean, we can't liberate one another if not all of us are liberated. And that goes into how we talk about the model minority myth and anti-blackness, and how the model minority myth is a way in which like the US as a nation state has elevated Asian American folks and Asian folks with the privilege of whiteness in order to continue and prolong anti-blackness sentiments. So that's what we have to talk about, is how even if there's like this competition, we can't talk about it in a way that's like elevating certain folks from one another, which like is what Jelena was saying, is that like people think that racism only exists when they experience it, which is not true, and how it's still prevalent in the way the structures are. So I think this discussion is like extremely important in order to like bring into discussion the different types of oppression and like how they work together in order for us to like productively work together as like communities to combat like the continuous like anti-blackness that is produced in like Asian communities or like other communities at that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I keep forgetting that this is a podcast. I'm like shaking my head instead of saying like mm-hmm, like how
Me
they do.
too.
So, oh, right. We have to talk.
Yeah.
I think everything that's been said, like obviously, like I agree with it, but it's also really interesting. I'm really happy we're having this discussion in general because a lot of people won't ever be able to have these discussions, like at all, just because a lot of times we have them in like academic settings or like collegiate settings and all that, and college is such a pain to get into or stay in.
Something I think is interesting. So I'm an avid TikTok user, and I'll see like a lot of TikTok. Not a lot. Okay, if here and there, I'll see Asian Americans calling this out, saying how we need to recognize that this is an issue that's been happening before we personally face it. And sometimes it feels like they forget older generations of Asian Americans faced racism. It's like all of a sudden, because it's happening to them now, right now, all of a sudden there's racism, as if like there weren't laws in place before that stopped miscegenation, all those things. Anyways, that's another topic. But I'll also see like TikToks um, of Asian folks further backing up the fact that they feel like they're the only ones fighting anti-Asian racism. And I just thought it was like wild how that was on my For You page. So like the For You page is where like that's basically like the top videos. And like so many people agreed with that sentiment. I don't know. It just felt like, yeah, like what James is saying, like how it's, we don't really have these conversations outside of academia. And then we see like how media is portraying everything. But yeah.
So it was kind of like what you had said about this idea of like not seeing like racism as real within your own community until it happens to you. I feel like that's really prevalent in our generation and the generations after us because social media and the use of technology in general like skyrocketed since the year like 2000. And now everything, we have access to basically everything now in the different outlets of media that we're receiving. We see these different like snippets of racism, but we never see like, we're not really ever given the either one the entire story or the aftermath of the story or different examples of that same thing happening like 50, 60 years ago, or even like the history that we're being taught. It's like not, it's kind of twisted to like make things seem better. Like I remember when I first learned about like racism in America, and I learned about it was sharecropping. The way it was spun in class made it seem like sharecropping was actually good.
Mhm.
And like so just different things like that like we're kind of put into this mindset where like, oh, racism, we know it's real, but we don't like know it's real until we start experiencing it, and then all of a sudden we make a fuss like, oh no, racism is real, but mm, how long has it been around?
Yeah. And On that same note, I recently saw a tweet from someone I know saying like or for context, this person is Filipino. Um, they tweeted, "Oh, I'm scared to go through the McDonald's drive-through because I'm Asian," and there are several times when we've called them out for their anti-blackness, but they don't regard it as anything. They don't want to have that conversation, but all of a sudden, COVID-19, they decide to want to talk about racism, and I think I'm not understanding like why it's so difficult for folks to have that conversation because they work in conjunction with one another. So, yeah, that's what I've been struggling with in terms of my own community and my own friend group.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's okay. So small shout out if you're listening to this and you have not watched the video on YouTube at the Cross Cultural Center's YouTube of xenophobia in communities of color, please go watch that because we talked very briefly about xenophobia within the Asian American community, and we talked about the model minority myth juxtaposed to this idea of whiteness. And we basically talked about how so the model minority myth it really others the Asian community from other minority groups. And when you juxtapose that to this idea of whiteness and how each minority group isn't really trying to fight to be more white, but like in this race of trying to better ourselves, we end up slandering each other for not being white enough. And the fact that the Asian community's already been so othered of not being a minority enough but not being white enough, it creates this constant back and forth between the Asian American communities and the other minority groups, so like Black, Latinx, and everything, constantly like fighting each other and attacking each other. And that's why even why you have a lot of anti-Asian sentiments in the Black community. And all while this is happening, we don't really realize, okay, why are we doing this? It's because this idea of whiteness that we're trying to go to and capture.
Yeah, I think going off of that, I think about it, the model minority myth and like the proximity the whiteness Asian Americans have due to that. So now because COVID-19 is bringing out these how do I say it, like attacks on Asians, they're seeing that this system that used to protect them is no longer working for them, when in reality it never was meant to work for them. And it's hard because like I don't want to. When I say that, I'm not saying like each individual Asian American is like that. It's like the not framework, because I keep saying the word framework, but I guess the framework with which we grew up in America, thinking that it was always supposed to work for us, and now we're kind of seeing like the cracks in the foundation of it. It was kind of interesting because I was also looking up like anti-Asian racism, and one of the articles, or no, so one article was saying like how the government needs to do more about it, and I think that's calling to like Asian Americans feeling like we had this position within whiteness where they need to protect us again. And then there's also another one, like the second article said anti-Asian racism must be stopped before it's normalized. And the term normalized, like really, like I was so annoyed at that and frustrated because, yeah, like calling back all the conversation we just had, like it's as if all other racism was normalized before.
Okay, so for the people who this is kind of like this is popping their bubble of like this perfect world, would you consider it ironic the fact that I don't know you're living in this world that you see as like it's fair, it's working for you, it's revolving around what you do and like who you are, and then out of nowhere, because it's something that doesn't even have anything to do with you, it's just the fact that it has something to do with part of your community, and even then, not really. You're immediately experiencing this backlash, basically for something that has absolutely nothing to do with you, and kind of connecting that to like anti-blackness in general.
It's kind of like the saying, like I hate, not, I don't, okay, it's kind of like the saying where you're as good as your weakest member, because when I think about like American society, capitalistic society, the folks that we put at the very bottom, like because they are hurting, at the end of the day, even those at the top are not living, kind of not living their best lives because the bottom is hurting. And I don't think they realize that. And then I think that's where it plays in, because Asian Americans were on this imaginary like scale, and they're not realizing that because it was made uneven from the beginning, they're finally receiving, not finally because they've received it before, like the backlash of the system that they were so silent on before, kind of. So I think it is ironic. But also it's hard because like at the same time I don't blame Asian Americans for being brainwashed kind of into the system. Um, because like I feel like ever since we were born, we were brainwashed to think like to be like the best like US citizens to continue perpetuating that system. So it's
Yeah.
like ironic. It's like kind of it's dramatic irony where like the audience knows what's going on, but the person that's going through it doesn't realize what's happening.
It's like a Shakespeare play.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but you're right. Like no one's really to be no one's really to be blamed for this brainwashing.
Right.
It's kind of like, when you're ignorant to things, you can't really be expected to know better or do better. It's only like when you actually know what's going on that you can be expected to do better. But like, yeah, no, everyone's really brainwashed into this idea of what our society is, including white people. But that's not our discussion today. Um,
Yeah. I think COVID-19 is really bringing into conversation what um, activists have been trying to bring into light. And I think that's really important, and like demonstrating how like the functions of a capitalistic society are very unrealistic and out of touch with the reality of folks who are living in it. Yeah, and I was just thinking a lot about that.
Especially because, like, I don't know, having a capitalist society, but also having a society where we want people to be equal, have equal opportunities, is kind of
It doesn't make sense.
like at all. It's so mind-boggling, which I think is why like it's so interesting talking about these things, because there's always like a fine line of like how you like we're talking about like anti-black sentiment in the Asian community juxtaposed to anti-Asian sentiments during COVID-19 or anything like that. It's
Mm-hmm.
There's such a fine line of like, hey, obviously these things are happening that shouldn't be happening to this community. It's very awful. But also there's been things happening in this community that harm other communities that should not have been happening either. And like addressing both, what one was already ignored before, but one wants to be focused on, is so, I don't know, that's mentally taxing to think about personally. There's
Yeah.
no
I,
simple, sorry, what?
oh no, you go ahead.
I was just gonna say there's no like simple way to go about it. That's it.
Yeah, and back to your point, it's like what I mentioned with the capitalistic society is that there's value, and like whose body is like deemed valuable, whose experiences are valued, or like which ones are being portrayed on media and stuff like that. And I think that's really bringing into conversation what we're talking about, but at the same time, it also reveals like which ones they want to talk about and like put forward.
Were there any other things you had all found about the topic, or should we talk about solutions slash what needs to be done?
I guess we can talk about solutions or like what you think should be done.
What'd you say?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess we can move forward with what you said.
I'm having fun. Having fun, feeling heard, you know.
Having fun doing social justice. This is a great time. Make the
Um,
world a better place, one podcast at a time.
yeah.
I think something for me, like since the get go, is like navigating, understanding that we grew up under kind of like this brainwash framework, but then also the emotional labor and burden I have to go through trying to explain it. Like when I think about being on Twitter, like being on social media, like when do I step in, when do I step out, things like that.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I kind of think in the beginning, it's all like it's important just to ask those questions to yourself, and then over time, like the answer of when you need to step in, step out comes easier. But at first, it's like you don't know, you really don't know.
Mhm.
But like at least like asking yourself that question is like the first step, I guess. I don't know. Answering like what we can do is so hard because I don't know, even doing like us doing this podcast, that's something we can do, but like if someone's listening to it and they disagree with it entirely, I we gave you information.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Like, there's just like so many things that we can do individually and collectively. Um, but how people receive that, I think, is like what is really the question. Like, how will people be like receptive to what we say? Or, yeah, or even having like the, or being able to initiate these conversations. And I think that's what made me interested in like pursuing social justice, is because I want to have these discussions. And I think like um, putting these, I guess like repeating what I said, like being able to mention this, or even like um, trying to find accessibility in the words we use in social justice to bring it in about in our communities. But I don't think it's our responsibility to make it like to make them understand, but just to like make sure it's like said, because like it can't be out of sight, out of mind type thing.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so when I think about like the different, power structures in play and all that, it kind of makes me think of like, so like if you're creating like I don't know, like some really big, like Lego building or structure, something,
Mm-hmm.
and how easy it is to like tear everything down, but it might have taken you like hours to put it together. Like I
Mm-hmm.
remember I had like this Lego thing as a kid. This is a weird tangent. I had this Lego thing as a kid that was like this like little mini basketball court, and I always used to love like putting it together because it would take me like 2 hours at least. Even if I was working fast, it still took so long. And then like tearing it down took like 5 minutes. And so that kind of always instilled this idea like, okay, it kind of instilled the importance of like, you know, it could take you a really long time to build something up or work with something, but it doesn't take very long to tear it down. But like
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
these structures, it's so often the opposite just because of like the different issues that or the different like worries people might have to go through, Like these structures took how many years to build. In reality, like even though they could fall down in like 3 days, how long is it actually realistically gonna take to change them? Which is
Right.
really I don't know, to me that's always really been a mental contradiction to what I've been taught by life, but we're here.
Mm-hmm.
I think for me, like what does give me hope is like thinking about how much my journey of activism has changed. Like there was probably like if who I was like 10 years ago existed today, I probably would be like one of the folks that agreed that Asian American racism was like something we have to combat now. But because of people who have started conversations with me and people and not just and me also being actively trying to create my um like actively reach out, it brought me to where I am today. So I feel like for me, like riding on that hope that that happens to not everyone else, but like just having this podcast too, like helps at least one person start like a whole like new journey in activism. I think that's what helps me keep going. Um, but yeah, but when it's like hard to think of it like in a big picture sense, just because everything's
Mm-hmm.
happening so fast right now.
And on yeah, same on the same note, like I've constantly been told like social justice is like a lot of emotional labor, and it's hard to see it come into fruition. And I think what you said is super validating for me too, and it's given me a lot of hope in terms of like what we can do. And it's also why I want to pursue teaching ethnic studies for little children, so that they also have like the same language that we use academically and also um, actively in social justice settings.
Mm. I'm not sure if there's anything else we should add.
Yeah, maybe just like wrap up thoughts. I think for me, before we had this dialogue, I was feeling very anxious and frustrated about everything, but being able to talk about it with y'all has helped me a lot. I think especially knowing that I'm not alone in thinking these things and like having these same frustrations, but then also having the same hopes for the future. Yeah.
I think for me, well, I guess I'll start off by saying, since people in the podcast can't see me, hi, I'm Black. So I'm saying this as someone, I'm saying this as someone from the Black community, just so I can get that understanding there. I'm not just talking to be talking. I know I've definitely seen my fair share of anti-Blackness from Asian American folk, and I've also been able to be in spaces where a lot of Black people will complain about it or the way it's happened in Asian American communities juxtaposed to like the Latinx communities or even like the white communities. And I don't know, it's kind of nice to have these discussions because so often when you're bombarded with these different examples and everything like that, you recognize and understand this is not by any means everyone, but it's still very easy to see those different examples popping up so easily. So discussions like this, talks like this, it's very, very nice, personally.
I guess just echoing off both of you, I think being in a home setting and not in the academic space I'm usually in, or in the social justice space that I'm usually in, where I get to have these conversations, I feel like it's been not refreshing in a way, because like this is a very hefty topic, but I guess it's like really good to be able to reflect on this topic with you all, especially since we can't do that right now since we're on a stay-at-home thing. But I've really enjoyed this conversation and have learned a lot from both of you. So thank
Yeah,
you.
this feels like a conversation we'd be having at work just randomly,
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Literally
Right.
just
I miss those. I
Me
feel like I
too.
never talk about it. Not that I switch it off. Like on social media, I'm obviously very, but like there's like literally no one at home to talk to with.
Yeah.
Okay. Any last words? I think we ended off on a good note. I'm happy. In the beginning, I was like, I don't know how we're gonna end this,
Yeah, me too.
but I feel good.
thank you everyone for listening. This has been our first Cultivating Conversations, the podcast name for the Cross Cultural Center. This has been James, Isabella, and Jelena. Thank you very much.